I just found innately that I enjoyed helping people because in the teams I wouldn't say I was brilliant, but I was better than most of the guys in the teams, and I wanted them to play well, and I wanted the teams to play well, and so it just became part of my path even when I was playing, and then when I couldn't play any longer or my aspirations ended, um, I started helping people, and I got some qualifications as I went down the road. If staff turn up or if leadership turn up and that they think that they are holier than thou, or that they think that they can circumvent the democracy which is central within a team, then there are going to be problems. And I think that's key to how teams work effectively is leadership need to embody those principles and also need to be transparent in those.
Hello and welcome to Stumped. I'm CS Chiwanza, and joining me today is one of the winningest coaches that I know. Former West Indies director of cricket, former Titans cricket. He's been around the world. I cannot compress his accomplishments in a brief introduction. Richard Pybus. Richard, welcome.
Chris, thank you. Good to be with you this afternoon, and saying hello to all the listeners and the viewers.
Richard, I know it's a term that I like to throw around, winningest coach. And you you have gone on to study the art of, I think it's the neuroscience of winning. But before you went there, before you started, you were already winning. It's not as if you went there to learn how to win, but you were already winning. You started winning at Selborne at under 19. How were those beginnings? How did you find your way into coaching?
Well, Chris, when I was a kid growing up in the northeast of England, I come from Newcastle, and and so when we were kids, I don't think I was any different to most other kids of my age in the UK at the time. As you're soccer crazy. I didn't know there were other sports. We just played out in the back lane all the time, and it was morning, noon, and night. Whenever it wasn't school, we were just in the back lane playing soccer. If we were at school, we'd be playing soccer before school, at break, and after school. So, and the whole point of playing the game is to win.
Hmm.
When you're a kid, I mean, going to primary school, you're 5, 6 years old. You take your jumpers off, you make goals, and then you go and play. And so, I don't think that changes from being a child when you first start start playing sport. Not that you think of that when you're a kid, you're just playing games. To when you're an adult, it's what sport is about, and so nothing in my mentality changed all the way through. And so whether it was, when I got introduced to cricket and rugby, it'd be the same. I mean, you don't play to lose, that's for sure. And with my sport, when my professional aspirations coming to an end in my early 20s, is wanting to, is I love sport. And my two favorite sports, I stopped playing soccer when I was about 15 or 16, but I used to mix soccer and rugby during the winter. And then I focused primarily on rugby because I was playing rugby league and rugby union on the weekend. And so the soccer fell by the wayside, and I love cricket and rugby just about as much as each other, but cricket prevailed.
Hmm.
Um, and I loved helping people. When I was at school, I wasn't great academically, but I had a physical education teacher
Hmm.
who thought that he could see something in me. So he encouraged me and he gave me leadership roles, and then I discovered that is that as captain of teams is how you communicated with players had a massive effect on how they responded, and he was really good in guiding me in how to communicate with people, just little lessons, not shouting at people and encouraging, um, and I just found innately that I enjoyed helping people because in the teams I wouldn't say I was brilliant, but I was better than most of the guys in the teams, and I wanted them to play well, and I wanted the teams to play well. And so it just became part of my path, even when I was playing. And then when I couldn't play any longer, or my aspirations ended, um, I started helping people, and I got some qualifications as I went down the road, and I was looking for opportunity. I just finished doing a qualification in education in the UK, a postgraduate qualification, and I'd already made my mind up. I wanted to go out, and in the English winter, I wanted to go out to the southern hemisphere and go and get coaching experience. And having grown up, having watched what was happening in South Africa, is and because the country was opening up and Mandela had been released, I wanted to come out, and I wanted to experience the country. And and quite an interesting aside is, I thought, okay, so who do I communicate with? And I thought, okay, well, who's the one person who can actually give me a direct answer, who can tell me, without me getting stuck at all the levels of advice. I thought, okay, let me write to Ali Bacher as the CEO of South African Cricket, and quite incredibly, Ali wrote back to me. And I know, in those days, it's before the internet, so obviously I'm typing out this letter. Actually, I don't even know if I could type back then; it was probably longhand. But so I've sent Ali a letter, and he replied, and then he gave me the names of people at the cricket unions. I wrote to the cricket unions, and slowly but surely, in the days of the snail mail,
Hmm.
his letters started coming back saying, you know, with inquiries about, how I could potentially, work at a club or work in provincial cricket, or whatever it might have been. And so, and I got invited to go to Selborne by the then headmaster, Tim Gordon, and it was absolutely brilliant. Sorry, I'm getting attacked by a fly here out in Southern Asia. And that was it. That's how I ended up out at Selborne. And and there were some fantastic cricketers. I love the sports environment. It was nice to be in an environment with people who are sports crazy as me. And Quentin Steele was my first S under 19, and then Bouchy came through at Solbourne. Had some other great young players. Laden Hamid, who now is the Titans conditioning coach. Laden came through. Jeff Love was at Solbourne. He played for Eastern Province and Border as an off spinner. So we had a lot of good young cricketers coming through. And then down the road in King Williamstown, a young gentleman called Mackay and Teeny.
Hmm.
And then just heading up up country a little bit, to Queenstown, there was a young man called Justin Kemp, and they were all pretty much in the same age group. So all these guys ended up being in the under 19 team, which I ended up taking a couple of years later. And so there's a whole group of young players coming through. So it's very exciting for me as a coach. Obviously, I'm on my journey as well. I don't know how good these kids are going to be.
Hmm.
But I can look back. I'm very chuffed at the progress they made, and some of them went to play for South Africa, but they were all fantastic cricketers, and they were a great group to work with. And so that was pretty much the beginning of the journey, and then after that, it just started to gain momentum.
And one of the things that interested me the most was you begin your career Eastern Cape and you're doing well, and then 3 years later you catch the attention of the Pakistani Cricket Board, and they asked you to come over, and it's the beginning of a lifelong relationship with a country because up until now you have people you work with who are over there, but and even then, while some might have thought you were green, you were winning. I think you took Pakistan to a final of a World Cup.
Yeah, we got to the final in '99. It's one of those things, you don't know what you don't know when you. I don't want to say when you're that young and naive, but yeah, I mean the sides were winning. I can't say that, and it's interesting because you spoke about the neuroscience earlier. Is the neuroscience just came much later because I was just fascinated in is what is the premise of how the learning takes place when we want to anything we want to get better at, we need to learn. Okay, but I think what gave me a head start on potentially on cricketers or people in other professions was that I went to uni, I got a degree, but it was in the arts, so it was all theoretical. I mean, it was interesting without it being very practical. and then I went and did a year at college studying education. And so in that, you have to then take knowledge, and then you need to break that knowledge out, and then sequence it in time, because now I had to put together blocks of work. And in my teaching, in in that year, I was seconded out to a teaching institute. It's called Colchester Institute, which is further education. So it is mature students, and now I'm teaching mature students, and some of them actually, were older than me. So it was quite intimidating. But now the work is time phased, because now you're within a syllabus. So you got to break it out, and now they've got exams coming up, and these are really important exams for them. And so there's nowhere to hide. You've got to do it thoroughly, and you've got to do it to the best of your ability. And obviously, the material is such that it's my competence has got to be such that I can get these guys over the line. So so it gave me an introduction in terms of taking material, breaking it down, putting it into blocks of learning, laying it out. And to be honest, without ever really being interested in academia, is that I really got fascinated by what I learned about learning. And so I fell into something which I was really fascinated by. And that fascination continues today. And so, yeah, that gave me a head start. So whatever was going on with in the sport is, you know, I mean, I used to help rugby players as well before I went off on the cricket path. But what I was sharing had a methodology to it. So it wasn't just a guy, sharing tips or stuff which he'd been, somebody had shared stuff with him, and then he decided that he was gonna share those tips on with somebody else. There's a clear methodology to it, and then you're taking the methodology and you're turning it into practice. So, when I looked back, when I went and did postgrad study a couple of years ago to understand it, I realised that the structure of that is what helped those cricketers to really take off. And the other thing which had happened, Chris, is that in my early 20s, and this is actually a key part of the jigsaw, I was at a friend's house, and his partner was doing a master's in sports science at Loughborough.
Hmm.
So this was probably late 80s, maybe 1990, and she had a book on sports psychology. And this book was all practical. So it wasn't like fluffy theoretical stuff. It was all practical by a guy who'd coached for decades working with Olympic athletes. So, and I took that book, and I read it, and I borrowed the book from her, and I took it, and then I used it. I used the practical exercises, and so I started working on positive visualization and imagery, and understanding the difference between the two, and I'm putting together performance scripts. And what was quite incredible is at that time I was really struggling with an injury, and so that season I couldn't practice properly, and but counterintuitively is I played better that season than I ever played before. And what had been happening again retrospectively, which as I went back and revisited how powerful it was, is in crafting these performance scripts and then using imagery and positive visualization, I was actually wiring performance into my brain without realizing having no understanding of how that was working. But the results were unbelievable. And so I took some of those exercises around actively working with faculties of the brain,
Hmm.
and exercises on goal setting, another great book that I'd found, and then I started using them with the players. So now the players had goal orientation, and I had practical exercises for them. And as much as anything else, just the goal setting act, gave them structure to taking whatever their ideas were, and us putting them into time. And so that border under 19 side, we went up to the Coquig at the time. We're the only side that were unbeaten. Four of the guys went on and played for S under 19s. Three of them went on to play for South Africa. And I've got absolutely no doubt that taking that methodology and using it with those young players were key steps in giving them that foundation.
You mentioned one of my favorite aspects when studying performance, which is visualization and imagery. Unfortunately, because I am not that educated, I cannot differentiate between the two. But what I do know is I've heard a few players speak of visualization, that they practice it before matches. It helps them. Famously, Herschel Gibbs says he did it, and Mr. 438, he did it. So it's one of those things that I would like you, as a performance coach, which is essentially what you are at the moment, help to break down for me, differentiate between visualization and imagery.
Well, do you know, Chris? One of the things is for me where I would get a little bit frustrated with psychology is, they love to take labels. As if, and I suppose, when we put a label on something, we can conceptualize it. But really, we're just playing with the human imagination, really.
Mm,
And so one of them, very simply, is if we're on the inside and we're thinking about something. When I say on the inside, is as if you imagine being inside your body, and you're like, for me, is the script which because I was like a fast medium swing bowler, is I designed this performance script which I crafted, and I would be in the inside of my body. So I'm the one who's running up. I'm the one who's accelerating into the crease, hitting the crease, my action being perfect, the release being perfect, control of the ball is perfect, pace that I wanted to be at, and then drawing the player into the shot, maybe taking the edge or beating the player through the gate, and then flowing into your follow through, the celebration afterwards, and so one is being on the inside of the experience. The other one is great from an editing perspective, where you can just literally be on the outside and have a look at yourself. And of course, the imagination can do all of those things.
mhm,
So for anybody who's listening and they're playing around with it, is we can be on the inside doing any task that we want. But if we want to get better at it, we need to be able to constructively be clear on what we want to do better.
mhm,
And it's interesting, because when kids play, typically they're copying their heroes or their heroines.
mhm,
So when I was a kid, and going back, is I got excited about cricket by watching the Australians, and it was in the early '70s when Australia came over on tour, and they had a couple of decent quick bowlers, one called Dennis Lilly, another one called Jeff Thompson, and obviously my tongue is in my cheek. I mean, Tom is probably the show Akhtar, up there as one of the quickest bowlers of all time, and then you've got Lilly, who was fated as being the greatest fast bowler of all time. He would definitely be in the top 10, but he was held up as one of the greats. And the drama of watching Lily bowl is that when I was in the back lane or down at the club or whatever, is every ball I was Dennis Lilly. So he was what excited me about cricket, and I copied him from when I was like a kid. And what you don't realize is that when you're watching and you're copying, you're learning.
mhm,
And I started getting identified and getting selected into teams. I had no idea why. I could take some wickets, but people thought that I had a great action. And because I'd copied him, I ended up with the same delivery, so I could bowl these great away swingers. And so, and it's funny, because when I would talk to Dale Steyn, to Stenke at the Titans, and we'd chat about bowling, etc. And he'd say to me, he said, "Listen, when he was growing up, he had a poster of Brett Lee. Brett Lee was his fast bowling hero, and he had a poster of Brett Lee on the wall when he was a kid. And I'd like to say that I think that Dale's actions was better than a Brett Lee, but it's that copying, that modeling. That's what we're doing. But as kids, you just play. That's not a psychological concept. It's what kids do. So so we're on the inside of the experience, and then we can be on the outside of it, and we can look at it, and we can edit, and we can rewind, and we can pause it, and we can do all of those cool things which the imagination can do.
The one thing that I caught that you were talking about was Dale Steyn had a poster of Brett Lee, and you envisioned Lily. It sort of made me think of this book I was reading. I'm forgetting who wrote it, but they say that they watched this young girl playing tennis, and she had a Roger Federer type of backhand. but she never consciously tried to copy Federer, even though she was a huge fan. But because she watched him so much
Mm.
and probably imagined that herself playing like that, it sort of just crept into her subconsciousness and, and then into her action. So is is this a realistic take or it's fanciful thinking?
No, not at all. I mean, everybody. I mean, since the beginning of time, we've learned by copying and modeling. That's it. We watch and we learn. And I remember out in the West Indies, my former player at Border, the former West Indies player, Vasbert Drakes, Vazzy was coaching, is still coaching Barbados. And, and when I started as director of cricket, I wanted to go. I travelled around the region and I spoke to the former cricketers. And I wanted to speak to the guys who were leaders. I wanted to hear what their thoughts were about what they wanted to see in West Indies cricket. The spirits of it, what they wanted to see in the way that the team conducted themselves and played, etc. Because the embodiment of that from across the region. And Gary was one of the guys. Gary was one of the guys I went and spoke to. So I had tea with Sir Gary, and he said to me, he learned by watching, as a boy, by watching the men play, by watching guys batting, and in the field. And while you're watching, you're learning. That's it. And he said, ultimately, you're just going out and you're doing what they're doing, but you're trying to improve it. And that's how learning takes place. So when sports psychology would take a concept, is we have to remember that really it's describing what is already there. You know, so it's important not to get lost in the science. I might be inventing a word here, but the scientification of something which humans do innately, really. So that and was one of the things which I realized in coaching Pakistan is their players are grown up by play. They weren't overcoached, so it wasn't overly structured. That's why you would end up, with Sack Lane inventing the doosra, or the guys being able to being able to bowl reverse swing, or Said Anwar would be able to open the blade and just like put the ball between point and extra cover where there's a meter, and then take the next ball and be able to put it through mid wicket. Is very in tune with that. You know, and so when I came back to South Africa after working with with Pakistan, it was one of the things that I really encouraged because of the structure in South Africa is getting guys to get back into experimenting and playing. You know, play with the delivery, explore the delivery, open your consciousness with your batting. It doesn't mean we've got to have in South African conditions. You've got really good, strong fundamentals because of the movement of the ball, but is it doesn't need to be regimented. And obviously, this was before T20. Now with T20 everything goes. But yeah, is to keep that openness around play as a medium for learning.
You mentioned the West Indies, and I love this part of your journey because you accomplished something big with them. Winning the 2016 T20 World Cup was no mean feat, and it was even greater because you had to coordinate various islands to get various players into various into a specific situation where they could perform well. How did you handle that period, that 2016 World Cup period for the West Indies?
Well, look, I mean, I started with the Windies in October 2013, and it's interesting because you I hadn't been to the West Indies before, and I was really excited about the job. And I would have grown up in the UK watching the West Indies play. A lot of my heroes were West Indies cricketers, two in particular being Viv and Malcolm Marshall, the late Malcolm Marshall, and 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 I think the West Indies would have inspired generations of kids from all over the world to play cricket because of the way that they played, not just the winningness. I mean, their record is unbelievable. That's 17 years in Test cricket where they just totally dominated. But that the way that they played, and Viv revolutionised one day batting long before people had thought of T20. Um, so to arrive there as somebody who, and again on reflection, I think about it because like, how are you received?
Mhm.
So you're received as somebody who's from England. I'm obviously of European descent, and even though I'm English, I'm speaking with a South African accent because I've lived out in South Africa for, I don't know, probably about 25 years. So I was thinking, okay, well, here's this guy. He's going to be director of cricket. He's going to come and sort out West Indies cricket. We're going to send this guy, who turning up like this, and he's got a South African accent. And it was, I was thinking, how do people receive you? Anyway, I must say, I mean, we had a tough time as a cricket board because I hadn't been, I'd forgotten about the fact, the industrial action between the board and the players went all the way back to the 70s, when with World Series cricket, probably even predated that. But back into that period in, I think it was maybe 77 when with the World Series and the West Indies, literally the whole of the West Indies side went out to went out to go and play in Australia and literally effectively gave up playing for the West Indies. And that industrial action had been running for decades. So, that was one of the first things that happened is the players went on strike in 2014. And I was out in India. So one of the things which was put, myself and Clive Lloyd had gone out to speak to the players about the changes which we were introducing,
Mhm.
which was to professionalize the game, is to build out contracts, to be able to give full-time contracts so players could train and play and train and get the right support as they did overseas. But anyway, is they went on a strike, and so it was really tough going. And coming out of that is a few of the former West Indies players said to me individually, they said, listen, if we knew what to do in terms of developing our cricket and getting on-field performance for the West Indies right, we would have done it. And if you've got ideas which you believe need to be implemented, then you need to move forward and do them because we've been pretty close to the bottom of world cricket for over a decade now, and we've it would have happened and it hasn't happened. So whatever you need to do, just move forward. And it was interesting because those three conversations were not one conversation; there were three individual conversations, but it was the same. It was the same conversation back to me. And what had happened in my learning in franchise cricket in South Africa with the Titans and then with the Cobras was refining this process of taking this coaching methodology, and through my iterations of working through different teams is working out how to deliver that coaching process to coach the winning process into different formats from T20 to one day and long form cricket to be able to win competitions. Now, as a coach, that's what I was about.
Mhm.
And is I have to develop those players to be able to populate those teams for us to win. If you're not doing that as a professional coach, you're going to be out of a job pretty quickly. So for me, it's just absolutely, you can't continue as a coach if you're not going to be winning. So, and if you're going to be beating other coaches, and obviously the level of sport in South Africa is a very, very high standard. Um, and if you're going to stay ahead of the guys that you're coaching against, you need to make sure you've got an edge on them. And so, at the Titans, we refined that process, and those players started to come through and play for South Africa. And then at the Cobras, when I joined Justin Kemp at the Cobras, is we went and did a treble, and it was actually we did the treble. We won the last two competitions of my first season, and we won the first competition of the next season. And in that treble, we held. I think we were the only side to have won three domestic titles in a row. And so, I don't think it had ever been done before. And so I realized in that refinement process there was a is that I'd refined it. It was supported by the science, and that it was reproducible from taking it from one setup in franchise cricket up in Centurion at the Titans, and then going down to the Cape where it's a totally different cricket culture. It might be within the same country, but it's a totally different cricket culture. And then to be able to get those winning, to be able to get that winning performance going pretty quickly. Now, because that was a first season,
Mhm.
so literally, we got going, and then we won those three titles in a row. And so coming back out to the West Indies, is I took the system which I had refined in franchise cricket, and I did that with international sides. And then I'd used particular data models. So I worked with a statistician to create data models to understand where we needed to find the metrics of what we needed to do to win competitions. So so employing this statistician to put these models together, and I looked at all the top sides in the world. I asked him to get a large sample size,
Mhm.
and that would be all the sides that were playing ICC at the senior level. The not the affiliates, all the full members, and then look at those key metrics. So if we're going to win World Cups, what are the numbers that we need to produce? And then taking those numbers and then reverse engineering the numbers back into a coaching process, and then putting in place in the team managements people who could actually manage, making sure we had the right managers
Mhm.
and having the right coaches in place to be able to deliver that. And so there was a lot of heavy lifting up front, and not all the people to start off with were the people we ended up with at the back end, because I really needed to make sure that the coaching staff understood the process by which we were going to develop these players. Now the men's side had already won the T20 World Cup two cycles back, and that was when Otis Gibson was the coach, and so they had an understanding of how to win.
Mhm.
And there was a core group of players that had come out of Trinidad, and there were some fantastic T20 cricketers, and they'd a lot of those players had already chosen their T20 path. So so that group of players who were playing in the T20 side for the West Indies were very mature and had a long history of winning. And Phil Simmons came in as the coach, and between Phil and Darren and the team management and that group of players, they were a very mature group of players. The under-19s and the women had never won a World Cup before, and so there were changes that came in there in terms of team managements and our high performance program, and then coaching these players to understand what do you need to do to be there on finals day,
Mhm.
and then how do you win the final. And again, coming back to studying that is in my own personal journey is I'd lost seven finals, including a World Cup final in '99, including a triangular final against Australia again in 2001. So taking sides to finals, but not understanding how to get sides over the line was part of my understanding of it. And then out of that is then really, really understanding how you work through the round robin phase of a competition, through quarters, through semis, through finals, and making sure you're on the podium at the end of it. And so that was a first in the history of cricket with the three sides winning the World Cup. And after that is just is realizing there is an absolutely clear science to this.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean you're playing against other sides. They want to win as badly as you do, but there is a clear science. And if you understand, and so let me correct that. There is a science which explains it, but then let's say the art is delivering that, because you're working with humans, you're not working with machines. So so yeah, that was it. So Chris, yeah, going back to the beginning of that journey of the West Indies and following that whole process through and all the pushback after the strike, etc., and then being challenged to actually come back to what I had learned through playing in a system in franchise cricket, where in franchise cricket you have no edge over the other franchises. Everybody gets the same budget, everybody gets the same size squad. There is nothing that you can leverage. It's all about being able to coach and how you manage those players and the quality of the players and the quality of the leadership.
And when you were with the West Indies, one of the things that you had to be wise about was how to get the different islands on the same page. Someone is working in Antigua, someone is in Trinidad and Tobago, someone is in Jamaica. It's people who are in different spaces. And the lessons that you learned from the West Indies, from coaching, from leading the West Indies, not, is what you then employed few years later when Rizwan came. I'm not sure who came to whom, but when you started to work with Rizwan and you helped him to elevate his T20 game, and how did that journey also start? You know, you and Rizwan getting together and helping him overcome whatever hurdles he had at the time.
I think one of the things is that when you're working in different cultures, like, as a kid, my parents moved a lot, and then we emigrated overseas. We went to Australia when I was in my teens, and then we moved back to the UK, and then my parents moved again down to the south. And even though it might sound like those are similar cultures, wherever you go, you're having to integrate into new cultures. And the north of England is very different to the south of England. Um, and the Australians may speak the same language, but they're very definitely not English. Um, and again, when I was at college, one of the things that one of the areas that I studied at college was communication. So and which didn't necessarily mean that I was a great communicator, but I was getting an understanding about verbal communication and non-verbal communication, and finding what works and what doesn't work. But I think the thing is, when you move in between, very specifically between cultures, and you move to, for instance, and you move to Africa, and with the country opening up in the early 90s, and different cultures coming together for the first time, since possibly in, I know, I mean, how does one describe that? Because in colonial history, is those cultures wouldn't have been integrated, that's for sure. So now there's this challenge in South Africa where these communities are coming together. And how do you create common ground? And how does sport create that? And how do we bring people from these different cultures, ethnicities, religions, um, and and do it in a way which is inclusive? And so there was a little bit of I suppose, of testing different ideas of how to get players onto the same page within, operating within a team. But I think one of the things which I learned quite early on was actually sitting with players and asking them, so what are we about? Let's clarify what our goals are first. We're playing for different competitions. T20 would have come in 2004. Prior to that, it would have been long form cricket and white ball cricket. So if we're playing for different competitions, and our goal is to win it, is to open that conversation up with the players and to ask them to be involved, and to contribute their thinking to that process, rather than being a coach coming from a perspective where the coach has all the answers. So I'd facilitate a conversation with the players, and then we'd look at, what are our training standards going to be, what do we need to do in terms of playing, training, on field, off field. What does being professional look like? How do we turn up as professionals? What can we take from sports science to be able to uplift and raise the level of our performance? And even little things like nutrition. I mean, we had a nutrition sponsor at the Titans, a company called PVM, and they would come and support our nutrition and the supplementation, and advise the players on where we could potentially get an advantage there. Um, and then and including people in that conversation at the center of it. I asked them originally to choose values which I believed, for them to choose those values, and then for us to make that where we would, for those values to be common values amongst all of us. And back in the day at Border, is the communities in that part of the Eastern Cape would be, there would be the white community, there'd be the Xhosa community, there'd be a smaller coloured community in the border region, obviously larger as you move down the Cape. Um, and then and then having that as an open conversation and choosing those values and saying, right, let us hold those values, and let's have everybody involved in making sure that we uphold these, and that's for staff and players. And so back in those days, I mean, there was myself as the coach with the side, and we had a conditioning coach, Greg King, and then it was pretty much the players. We didn't have big support staffs in those days, so that was it. That was our team body, and but everybody had the ability to be able to call anybody else out. So if I was late for whatever reason, I also had to pay my fines. And I think just having it as democratic and as equal as possible, um, and that you as leadership, for myself and the captain, who was Peter Straden, nobody was above those values of the team. And myself and Peter had to answer the team, if the players felt that we were falling short. And I would have taken that when I worked with Pakistan, and I would have refined that from being values into principles. Because cross culturally, you can see that values can be quite rubbery in terms of from a cultural perspective, but principles are universal. And so I moved from values to principles because there would be things working in South Asia which would be culturally completely different to living in Africa or in Europe, but the principles were exactly the same. And so there was a commonality there, and we met within those principles. And I think it just allows players and staff to be able to communicate. If staff turn up, or if leadership turn up, and that they think that they are holier than thou, or that they think that they can circumvent the democracy which is central within a team, then there are going to be problems. And I think that's key to how teams work effectively is leadership need to embody those principles and also need to be transparent in those. And so that was easier from a team perspective. Going back to what you were saying with Rizvan is that I think the key thing with Riz is that Riz really passionately wanted to get better. And it's funny, I like the way that you said that, because when I started working with Pakistan in '99, is here I am decades later being asked to go and work with Riz. And that was through an introduction. It was actually Riz's agent who knew all and had worked with and had worked with the former Pakistan players that I'd worked with. And they said, listen, Richie could do a good job. Maybe Richie could help Riz. And that's what it was. So Riz and I did 3 months' work. And wherever he was in the world, we'd just jump on a call. And that went back to me knowing and understanding. And our call dropped out, so I heard a little bit of it. But when you were asking about how we're running those teams out in the West Indies across all those different communities and those different territories, this was pre-COVID, and we were doing everything on Zoom, or we were doing it on Skype. And sometimes, if there were issues, we'd get on a telecall and we'd do it like that. But it was exactly the same principles. It was inclusive, it was democratic, it was grounded in equality, and for all of us to unpack that early to make sure we lay the ground of how we were going to relate to each other. And just going to Riz is that Riz really, really passionately wanted to improve his game. So it wasn't a player coach relationship where a player was turning up, and he was sort of 60% in. He was 100% in, you know. And so I shared with him, and we looked at the structure of his game. We looked at his mental processes. And Riz had barely got a game for 2 years in the PSL. He'd been warming the bench, and he just made his breakthrough in the Test side with Misbah ul Haq as the coach. Misbah had seen something in him. His red ball numbers were pretty good. And so Riz and I worked on his red ball game, and we worked on specifically around his T20 game. But we looked at the architecture of the innings, and we looked at those mental processes, and we looked at the structure of that. And Riz might be in New Zealand on one part of it, and he might be on tour somewhere else. And so we just picked up on a Zoom call, and it didn't matter where he was. Is the coaching process worked perfectly. And since then, I've done it with many individuals, both in sport and doing it in corporate. So this little conversation we're having here with this awesome technology is we don't physically need to be present with each other. Is the coaching process is the coaching process.
And um, one of the questions I asked you the last time was, can we make winning a habit? And I will go back to the first thing you told me, that as a kid, and this is so true for everyone, we all want to win. When we play sports as youngsters, the desire is to come out on top. When we watch, even as fans, we want to come out on top. But it's one thing to do it at regular intervals or randomly. How then can we tap into the neuroscience of the side of things to make it more habitual? Yes, we're competing against other people who also have a desire to win, but from our end, what can athletes do from their end to try to put themselves into that habit of winning?
Yeah, that's Chris. That's a great question. That's really what all coaching should be about. And how can we support our athletes? And also, I'm speaking to coaches now. Because if you want to work, it doesn't matter whether you're working in amateur or you're working in professional. Our job is to help individuals realize their potential. And if there aren't clear principles which support the theory and the practice of our work, then really we're just handing on tips and tricks. So neuroscience is explaining how the brain learns, and it is quite remarkable. For us to be living in a period of time where we have learned more in 20 years about the brain than we would have learned in the whole of human history through the imaging technology, which is explaining how the nerves in the brain grow and connect as a wiring system, and how that learning process takes place. And so of understanding that when we are coaching, we need to be very clear on the structure of the way that we are sharing information and innately how do brains learn. When we're born, there's no manual.
Mhm,
There's no adult that needs to teach a child how to walk.
mhm,
You know, the child sees adults moving and walking, and so the child slowly, these patterns of movement are baked into the design of the human. So, for those of us who are parents, we would have seen it with our babies when they're very small. They start to rock when they're in their crib, then they start to roll, and slowly but surely these patterns of movement are being expressed and they're being learnt. And so the baby eventually gets onto its knees, and then it can start to find something to pull itself up on. And so it stands for the first time, then it balances, and then it falls. And the learning process is coming through taking action. Now, the falling is not failure, the falling is learning.
mhm,
So when we are designing the learning process, the feedback which we're getting is completely neutral. It's not, it's so when we set a goal, the failure to attain the goal is feedback to guide us as to how to get it correct. And so how we communicate that to players or anybody that we're working with is critical. Because if we're giving negative feedback or we are criticizing somebody in their learning process, we are inhibiting that. So what the technology is showing us that when the neurons in the brain are joining together to create circuits of learning, it's a little bit like designing writing computer code
mhm,
as an analogy. Is that when these synapses are joining together, they are joining together through focus and repetition. And that focus is visual, it's auditory through our ears, it is through touch, it's through all of our senses. And so when we're wiring that together, we need to get the structure right. But if we're coaching players and we keep on saying to a player that 1 plus 1 is 3, is they're going to go out into the world and in their world 1 plus 1 is 3. except they keep on getting the wrong results. So we need to get that structure right. So when we're looking at that learning process, is making sure we're laying those foundations of learning. So that is what's incredible about neuroscience, is explaining the learning process. And there are some really great resources out there where people have taken that knowledge and turned it into learning process to be able to help coaches. So I'm not going to open that all up now, but for me going forward for coaching, and it's there. Anybody can go on Amazon, just you type in neuroscience and coaching, they'll find plenty of stuff there. Is neuroscience is explaining how learning takes place, and so when we understand that, we can accelerate the learning for the player, and effectively for teams and for organizations, we can accelerate the learning that takes place within a team. We can accelerate the learning which is taking place of how to become a winning team and a winning organization. Because in sport, if you're not winning, what are you selling? And then for an organization outside of that, because I'd coach corporate, I'd coach execs, I'd work with execs, particularly in the financial field, is how are you then taking that knowledge and getting that and turning that into performance in your field of expertise, because it's no different.
I like that earlier on, again, you said that the science is not coming up with the solutions. The science is just explaining things that have already been tested in the world. And for example, when you did your PhD, you were not looking at the science for the answers, but you were using the science to sort of reflect on your experience. It's not what some other people experience and you heard about it secondhand, but you experienced it. You made mistakes. You learned from mistakes. You did the right things. You learned from that, and you collated it and made it a part of your PhD. And how was the process?
Yeah, I think the thing about doing the doctorate is in it's called professional practice. So what you're doing is you're reviewing your professional body of work. And one of the things I wanted to answer that question: how could I take this learning which I'd learned in France, particularly from the formative years in coaching and being grounded in learning theory from college, putting that into practice in a sports domain, starting to get good results, producing players, going through those iterations with different teams, with Border and Pakistan where we were doing well, but I wasn't with the side, I wasn't with those sides long enough to consolidate that learning process. And I knew that when I went to the Titans to be able to get those results, I needed to be with those players. Now, I didn't necessarily end up like that, because after a couple of years, the Titans left me sitting in limbo, and the board weren't sure whether they wanted me to continue. And as it would have transpired, is I left and I came back. Not that I wanted to leave in the first place, with all due respect, but that 4 years of working through the testing of refining of that process within a model which is, as I described earlier, in the franchise system, where you have no competitive advantage. You can't leverage anything, because your budget and your player resources, it's how you coach. You can't. It's not like football where you can go to a marketplace and you can just buy and sell players. You have to develop players, and you have to develop the team. So, in testing that, and seeing that that works, and seeing that you could take a methodology and then plug it into another cricket culture down in Cape Town at the Cobras and get the same results and get them very quickly, is like, okay, well, wow, right, so there's something in this. And then going to the West Indies and taking that same program, breaking it out, because I had to take it and turn it into documents now, because effectively I was creating a manual of standard operating procedures. And I did that. I hadn't done it before. I took all the coaching material and I turned it into standard operating procedures, almost like an operations manual for coaches and for team staff, for the coaching unit, particularly in high performance and in selection, and sharing those statistical models for selectors to look at the data to inform our selection process, and then taking that and going, okay, so, and then winning the World Cups, and then giving the men's senior team and having no time to prepare the men's senior team, And it might look like, okay, so you wave a magic wand and all of a sudden West Indies beat England. But it was actually, there was a clear process to how we beat England in 2019. And they'd only beaten England once in 20 years prior to that. So how do you take that methodology? How do you take that process and put it in and really, if I say that we had less than a week to prepare that side for that series against England, we had less than a week. And yet the structure and the architecture of that, of going through that process with the players, is the winning took place. And the evidence was there. So from now, without making that information explicit, taking it and turning it into taking that theory, which is stuck in the space between a coach's ears, is if you don't take that material and review it, make it explicit, and then critique it so you can understand it. How would you share this? And that's ultimately what the doctrine was about, is to understand that. So if it's going to be repeatable and replicable, which I believe it is, and I've got no doubt about it, and it's been tested over and over, if you're going to share it, is then you've got to take it and you've got to turn it into a working document. So effectively, the doctorate was explaining that process, and that's what it was about. And then in doing the review and the reflection, some of the things which I've shared here about those key points, like taking those exercises as a young player, and then discovering that through doing the visualization exercises, I was in reflection wiring performance into my brain. So I can't train as much because of injury, but I'm getting better performance. Now, how does that work? Because it was the mental process. Now, there's a huge amount, there's a huge body of work which explains that now, and there's been lots of tests done, and it's evidential. So I'm not sharing anything on this call which is like miraculous, because it's all there. But taking that and then designing that into a coaching process for players, and then being able to explain about that with a clear science. Now that to me is exciting.
Richard, thank you very much. I could just sit and ask more questions, but I know that I have to let you go. You have coaching work to do that you're doing in Bangladesh at the moment. How's Southeast Asia treating you? South Asia, or is it Southeast? I'm not too sure about my geography.
Yeah, well, yeah, my geography isn't brilliant either, but I'm in South Asia. You're in Southern Africa, where yeah, it's great. It's working with young players out here and helping them develop the game. We've got some of the internationals, some of the Bangladesh internationals. We've got a lot of professionals. We've got emerging players, and we've got a lot of coaches. So upskilling them in their education as well. So it's really enjoyable. Um, so yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks for the opportunity to share with you, and I look forward to doing more of these with you in the future, sharing 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 the word on coaching and practice and methodology, and being able to support other coaches and players with that. Thank you.
No, I'm very happy. I'm actually honored to have done this because we always read about these things, your accomplishments, and everything else you do. So it's always great to have you on stamped.